Iris Vance's hand was perfectly steady as she reached for the door handle of the Grand Meridian Conference Hall, which was more than could be said for the man currently standing at the pitch podium inside. The man whose voice she'd recognize anywhere even after 4 years of blessed silence. Derek Whitmore, her ex-husband, the man who'd spent a decade systematically destroying everything she was before discarding her like garbage. And she paused for just a heartbeat before entering, because her husband, Oliver Stratton, had his hand on the small of her back, protective and grounding, and he leaned down to whisper, "Are you sure you want to go in? We can have Charles handle the final evaluations." But Iris shook her head, because she'd spent 10 years running from confrontation, from standing up for herself, from claiming the space she deserved. And she was done running, done shrinking, done letting Derek Whitmore occupy any real estate in her emotional landscape, except perhaps this one final moment of reckoning that she hadn't planned, but that the universe had apparently gift-wrapped and delivered to her door. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to a story about karma's perfect timing and the sweet taste of justice served ice cold. I'm so glad you're here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and whether you believe the universe keeps score. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do that now, because this tale has layers that will leave you speechless. Hit that button and settle in while I tell you how Iris went from broken and bankrupt to brilliant and beloved, while her ex went from arrogant to absolutely desperate. And trust me, you need to hear what happens when they come face to face after years apart with completely reversed fortunes. Oliver's fingers tightened slightly on her waist. A silent question, and Iris turned to look at her husband. This man who'd appeared in her life like some kind of miracle when she'd been at her absolute lowest, working the front desk at New Horizons Foundation for 60 hours a week just to make rent on a studio apartment that had roaches and a broken heater, answering phones and filing paperwork for an organization that helped women rebuild after domestic situations, after financial abuse, after exactly the kind of systematic destruction that Derek had inflicted on her. And Oliver had walked in one Tuesday afternoon, asking to speak with someone about the Foundation's programs. And Iris had assumed he was another social worker, or maybe a lawyer, offering pro bono services. Certainly not the anonymous benefactor who'd been funding 70% of their operating budget for 3 years. And definitely not a billionaire tech mogul who'd built his empire on data security software and strategic investments. He'd looked so normal in his simple sweater and jeans, kind eyes that actually listened when she'd explained their mission, their success rates, their dreams for expansion if they ever had the funding, and he'd asked her to coffee, just to talk more about the foundation, he'd said. And Iris had been so naive, so focused on selling him on their work, that she hadn't noticed he was asking about her. Her story, her plans, her half-abandoned dreams of finishing the business degree she'd started 15 years ago, before Derek had convinced her his construction company needed her more than she needed education, before he drained her college fund to cover his gambling debts, before the affair started, before she'd become a shell of herself, desperately trying to hold together a man who was determined to fall apart and take her down with him. Oliver had come back the next week, and the week after, always with questions about the foundation, but increasingly with questions about Iris herself. What did she want? Where did she see herself in 5 years? Had she ever considered going back to school? And when he'd offered to pay for her degree, she'd refused instantly, pride flaring hot and defensive. "I'm not a charity case," she'd said, perhaps too sharply. And Oliver had smiled that patient smile she'd come to love, and said, "I know. I've read your proposals for the Foundation's restructuring. You have a brilliant business mind, and it's being wasted on filing. I'm not offering charity. I'm making an investment in someone I believe in." And something in Iris had cracked open then, the idea that someone could see value in her after Derek had spent years telling her she was worthless, that she was lucky he stayed, that no one else would want damaged goods, that her level was exactly where she was, and she should be grateful he'd ever looked at her twice, even while he was sleeping with her best friend, her coworker, the neighbor, a parade of women who were apparently all better than her in ways Derek enthusiastically detailed during their final argument when he told her he was leaving, moving in with Simone, the 26-year-old dental hygienist who was actually going places, unlike Iris, who'd given up on being anything special. That had been 4 years ago, 4 years that Iris had spent rebuilding brick by brick, finishing her MBA while working full-time, discovering she had a gift for financial strategy and business development, falling slowly and then completely for Oliver, who courted her with patience and respect and genuine partnership, who asked her opinion and valued her input, and made her feel like she'd been starving for years without knowing it. And when he'd finally told her 6 months into dating that he was actually Oliver Stratton, the Stratton of Stratton Security Systems, billionaire investor, and the anonymous donor who'd founded the very organization where they'd met, Iris had been shocked, but also strangely unsurprised, because of course this man who saw her so clearly had been orchestrating goodness from the shadows, creating safety nets for people who needed them, and he'd been terrified she'd be angry about the deception, but Iris had just kissed him and whispered, "You gave me back my life before you ever gave me your heart. How could I be anything but grateful?" And they'd married 4 months later in a ceremony so intimate and perfect that Iris sometimes still couldn't believe it was real. Couldn't believe she got to wake up next to someone who treated love like a verb, like something you built and maintained and honored daily. The thing about rebuilding yourself from nothing was that you never really forgot what rock bottom tasted like. Iris thought, as Oliver guided her toward the conference hall's entrance, his presence solid and real beside her, and she remembered with visceral clarity the night Derek had left, how he'd packed his clothes while Simone waited in the car outside, how he'd looked at Iris crying on their bedroom floor and said with genuine disgust, "Look at yourself. You're pathetic. You really thought you were enough for me. You're barely enough for anyone. You'll never rise above your level, and your level is pretty damn low." And those words had burrowed into her skin like parasites, had lived in her chest for months afterward when she'd been evicted from the apartment, because Derek had stopped paying rent 3 months earlier without telling her, when she'd discovered he'd maxed out credit cards in her name, when bill collectors called constantly for debts she didn't know existed, when she'd finally understood that the man she'd loved hadn't just cheated on her body, he'd systematically stolen her financial future, her credit, her stability, everything. And the worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was how small he'd made her feel, how she'd started to believe his assessment, that maybe she really was worthless. Maybe her level really was rock bottom, and she should just accept it. Oliver had met her 6 months after Derek left. 6 months of Iris sleeping in her car and then finally in a shelter until she'd gotten the job at New Horizons Foundation. And she'd been so brittle then, so defended, flinching away from kindness because it felt like a trap. But Oliver had been patient in ways that defied logic. He'd shown up consistently, never pushed, never demanded more than she could give. And slowly, like a plant turning toward light, Iris had unfurled toward him, had started to believe that maybe Derek's assessment had been wrong. Maybe her level was actually higher than she'd imagined. Maybe she'd just been with someone determined to dig down instead of build up. Oliver had supported her through the MBA program at Columbia, had celebrated every A like it was a personal victory, had helped her study for exams and proofread her papers, and never once made her feel like she owed him anything beyond her genuine self. And when Professor Chen had told her she had a rare gift for financial analysis and strategic planning, Iris had cried in the bathroom afterward because someone intelligent and credentialed was seeing value in her brain, in her contributions, in the ideas that Derek had always dismissed as stupid or naive. And she'd started to understand then that she'd been living in a funhouse mirror for a decade, that Derek's reflection of her had been deliberately distorted to keep her small and controllable. The foundation work had saved her in ways that transcended the paycheck, being surrounded by women who'd survived what she'd survived, who understood the particular devastation of loving someone who weaponized that love. Her colleague Maria Torres had become a close friend, a survivor herself who'd rebuilt her life after her ex-husband's abuse had put her in the hospital, and Maria had been the one to encourage Iris to apply for the Director of Operations position when it opened up. "You're brilliant at this. You see patterns and solutions the rest of us miss. You could transform this place," Maria had said, and Iris had applied and gotten the position and discovered she loved leadership, loved building systems that worked, loved watching women come in broken and leave empowered. And Oliver had been so proud, had taken her to dinner and told her he'd always known she was destined for exactly this kind of impact. And Iris had finally worked up the courage to ask him why. Why her? Why had he pursued her when he could have anyone? And Oliver had been quiet for a long moment before saying, "I saw your intake file at the foundation, saw what you'd survived, and how you were still showing up, still helping others despite barely surviving yourself. And I saw strength that most people never develop because they're never tested that hard. I saw someone who'd been told she was worthless, but kept acting like she had value anyway. And I wanted to know the person, wanted to be near that kind of resilience. And then I met you, and you were even more remarkable than I'd imagined. Funny and kind and brilliant. And I fell in love with who you actually are, not who I thought you might be." And Iris had understood then that Oliver had known her story from the beginning, had sought her out deliberately, and she should maybe feel manipulated, but instead felt seen, felt like someone had finally recognized her worth even when she couldn't see it herself. Now, 4 years after Derek had told her she'd never rise above her level, Iris was the chief operating officer of New Horizons Foundation, which had expanded to 12 cities under her leadership. She had her MBA from Columbia with honors. She was married to a man who treated her like a partner and an equal, and most importantly, she had rebuilt her sense of self into something Derek could never touch again. She knew her value now, knew it bone deep, and no man's opinion could shake that foundation. But what Iris didn't know, what Oliver hadn't told her yet, was that Derek's appearance at this pitch competition wasn't coincidence. Oliver had been tracking Derek's business failures for 2 years, had quietly ensured certain investors passed on his ventures, had strategically dismantled the man who'd nearly destroyed his wife, and the business Derek was pitching today, the last chance venture he'd scraped together with borrowed money and desperate hope, was actually owned through a shell corporation by Iris herself. Oliver had purchased it 6 months ago and transferred it to her name. And when Derek learned that the woman he'd called worthless now literally owned his last chance at redemption, when he understood that his fate rested in the hands of the person he'd most damaged, that would be justice. That would be the moment Oliver had carefully orchestrated. But first Derek had to see them, had to understand what Iris had become. And that moment was seconds away as Oliver opened the conference hall door and gestured for his wife to enter first, always first, because that's how you treated someone you actually valued. The conference hall fell into a peculiar silence the moment Iris walked in beside Oliver. Not the natural quiet of attention, but the charged hush of collective recognition, because everyone in the room knew who Oliver Stratton was. His reputation preceded him like weather, and the panel of 5 judges at the front table all turned simultaneously, their expressions shifting from professional courtesy to genuine warmth when they saw him. But Derek Whitmore at the podium had his back turned, was mid-sentence about projected revenue streams for his construction management app. His voice carrying that same confident arrogance Iris remembered, the tone that said he expected the world to fall at his feet simply because he'd shown up. And she felt Oliver's hand press gently against her lower back, steering her toward the judges' table where 2 seats remained empty, the seats they'd been late for because Iris had needed an extra moment in the car to compose herself. when Oliver had told her casually that the final presenter was Derek Whitmore, and she'd asked how he knew, how he'd possibly known, and Oliver had simply said, I always know what concerns you, love. I've made it my business to know, which should have struck her as odd, but in the moment felt protective, felt like someone finally standing guard over her heart. Derek was saying something about market penetration and user acquisition when Iris and Oliver reached the table, her heels clicking on the marble floor, and she saw the exact moment Derek registered new arrivals and turned. Saw his eyes land on Oliver first with that calculating assessment of potential money, then slide to Iris beside him, and the recognition hit Derek like physical impact, his mouth literally falling open mid-word, his laptop remote clattering from his hand to the podium, and Iris watched 10 different emotions cross his face in 3 seconds. Shock, confusion, disbelief, and finally something that looked like fear, raw and undisguised. Because Derek had always been able to read rooms, and this room was telling him something impossible. That his broke, pathetic ex-wife was somehow connected to Oliver Stratton, was somehow standing beside a billionaire like she belonged there. And Derek's brain was visibly trying to compute the math and failing. Oliver pulled out Iris's chair with perfect courtesy, waited until she sat before taking his own seat, and the head judge Marcus Chen, a venture capitalist Oliver had worked with for years, smiled warmly and said, Glad you could make it. We saved you the best for last, apparently. And there was dry humor in his tone, because Derek's pitch had clearly not been impressive. And Oliver nodded and opened the folder in front of him. All business now. But Iris couldn't look away from Derek, who stood frozen at the podium, his face cycling through shades of red and white. And she realized with sudden clarity that he still saw her as that broken woman on the bedroom floor, still expected her to be small and defeated, still couldn't reconcile the polished, successful woman in the designer suit with the person he'd labeled worthless. Mr. Whitmore, Oliver said pleasantly, his voice cutting through the awkward silence. Please continue. You were discussing user acquisition strategies. And it was a kindness, really, giving Derek a chance to recover, to finish his pitch. But Derek just stood there, his eyes locked on Iris. And finally he said, Iris, what are you? How are you? And his voice cracked on the last word, and Iris felt a surge of something complicated. Not quite triumph. Not quite pity. Maybe just a strange satisfaction of being underestimated and then revealing your true form. And she smiled politely, the smile she'd perfected in MBA negotiations and board meetings, and said, Hello, Derek. It's been a long time. Please don't let us interrupt your presentation. The other judges were looking confused now, sensing personal history, but not understanding the dynamics. And Derek seemed to gather himself with visible effort, seemed to remember that he needed these investors desperately, that his entire financial future hung on this pitch. And he turned back to his slides, but his hands were shaking. His voice had lost its confidence, and he stumbled through the remaining 7 minutes like a man walking through fog, missing key points, forgetting statistics. And Iris felt Oliver's hand find hers under the table, his fingers lacing through hers in silent support. And she squeezed back, grateful for his steadiness. And when Derek finally finished with a weak, So that's why BuildWise represents a unique investment opportunity. The silence that followed was damning, the kind of quiet that said nobody was convinced, nobody was interested. And Marcus Chen cleared his throat and said, Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. We'll confer and be in touch. Which was code for no, was the polite dismissal every entrepreneur learned to recognize. And Derek's face crumpled slightly before he caught himself, and he started gathering his laptop and papers. But instead of leaving, he did something Iris hadn't expected. He walked directly toward the judge's table, toward her, his eyes desperate now, and he said, Iris, I need to talk to you. Privately, please. It's important. And every protective instinct in Oliver went rigid. She could feel the tension in his body. But Iris raised her free hand slightly, a gesture that said she could handle this. And she looked at Derek, really looked at him, and saw what 4 years had done. The lines around his eyes, the cheaper suit, the desperation that clung to him like cologne. And she said calmly, clearly, "I don't think we have anything to discuss, Derek. But if you need to say something, say it here." And Derek glanced at the other judges, at Oliver, and something like anger flickered across his face. And he said, "You're with him. You're actually with Oliver Stratton. How is that even possible? You're. And he stopped himself, but the word hung in the air anyway. The word he'd called her so many times. The assessment of her worth. And Iris stood up then, drew herself to her full height, and said, "You were right, Derek. I didn't rise above my level. I just realized you were never mine." And the words landed like grenades. And Oliver stood beside her and added quietly, "You destroyed the woman who could have built your empire," and gestured to security. And as two guards approached to escort Derek out, Iris added one more thing, her voice steady and final. "Oh, and Derek, Buildwise, the company you're pitching, I own it. Bought it through acquisition 6 months ago, so you've been asking me to invest in my own property." And Derek's face went absolutely white as the truth detonated. The car ride back to their penthouse was silent. Not the comfortable quiet Iris had grown accustomed to in 4 years with Oliver, but something heavier, charged with unspoken questions that pressed against her chest, until she finally said, "You bought my ex-husband's company." And it wasn't a question, it was a statement seeking explanation, and Oliver kept his eyes on the road, his hand steady on the wheel of the Aston Martin. And he said, 6 months ago, through a shell corporation, yes." And Iris waited for more, for justification or apology. But Oliver just drove, and she felt something uncomfortable twist in her stomach. Not quite anger, but adjacent to it. Because the triumph of Derek's face when she'd revealed the ownership had felt good in the moment, but now felt complicated. Tainted maybe by the realization that Oliver had been moving pieces on a board she hadn't known existed. And she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And Oliver's jaw tightened slightly. The only tell that he'd heard the edge in her voice. And he said, "Would you have let me do it if I'd asked?" And that was fair, Iris had to admit. She would have said no, would have insisted she didn't need revenge, didn't need Oliver fighting her battles. But that wasn't really the point, was it? The point was partnership, transparency, the foundation they'd supposedly built their marriage on. And she said, "That's not how this works. We don't keep secrets because we think the other person can't handle the truth. That's what Derek did. That's what abusers do. They decide what you can and can't know." And she heard her voice rising, heard the accusation in it, and Oliver pulled the car over suddenly, right there on Park Avenue, and turned to face her fully, his green eyes intense and focused. And he said, "You're right. I should have told you. I was wrong. But Iris, watching what he did to you, reading those files, seeing how he systematically destroyed your credit, your confidence, your sense of self, I wanted him to hurt the way he hurt you. I wanted justice for what you survived. And maybe that was selfish. Maybe that was more about my need to protect you than your actual needs. And I apologize." And his honesty diffused her anger immediately. Because this was the difference. Derek would have deflected, would have made it her fault for being upset. But Oliver took accountability, met her where she was. And Iris felt tears prick her eyes and said, "I need to be part of decisions that affect my life. Even the revenge parts. Especially the revenge parts. Because that's my past and my healing, and you can't orchestrate it without me." And Oliver reached across the console and took her hand and said, "I know. You're absolutely right. No more secret maneuvers. No more playing chess with your life. I promise." And Iris believed him because Oliver had never broken a promise to her. Not once. But she also felt something shift. a recognition that even good men, even loving husbands, could overstep, could let their protective instincts override their partner's autonomy. And this was the work of marriage, the constant negotiation of boundaries and needs, and the space between two people who loved each other, but were still fundamentally separate beings with different ideas about how to heal old wounds. They drove the rest of the way home in better silence, hands linked across the console. And when they got to the penthouse, Iris kicked off her heels and poured herself a whiskey, something she rarely did, but today felt like a whiskey day. And Oliver loosened his tie and joined her on the balcony overlooking Central Park. The city spread out below them like scattered diamonds. And he said, "Tell me what you're thinking. All of it. Don't filter." And Iris took a sip of the burning liquid and said, "I'm thinking that seeing Derek's face when he realized I owned his company felt amazing and terrible at the same time. Amazing because he spent a decade telling me I was worthless, and today I proved him wrong in the most spectacular way possible. Terrible because I don't want to be the kind of person who takes pleasure in someone else's destruction, even someone who destroyed me first." And Oliver nodded slowly and said, "That's because you're good, genuinely good. It's one of the things I love most about you. You have every right to be vindictive, and you still choose kindness." And Iris laughed, a sharp sound without much humor, and said, "I don't feel kind. I feel angry. I feel like 10 years of my life were stolen, and no amount of success now gives me back the woman I could have been if I'd never met Derek Whitmore." And that was the truth she'd been avoiding, the grief underneath the triumph. And Oliver set down his glass and pulled her against his chest, his arms solid around her, and said, "You're right. He stole years you can't get back, and that's not fair. And nothing I do can make that fair. But Iris, the woman you are now, the woman who rebuilt herself from nothing, who turned pain into purpose, who helps other women find their strength, that woman is extraordinary, and maybe she wouldn't exist without the breaking. Maybe the fire forged something Derek could never have anticipated." And Iris let herself cry. Then, really cry, for the first time since the confrontation. Let out the complicated mess of emotions. The validation and the grief and the anger and the love she felt for this man who saw all of her, the broken parts and the rebuilt parts, and chose her anyway. Chose her completely. Later, after the tears had stopped and they'd ordered Thai food and eaten it on the couch like normal people instead of billionaires, Oliver said carefully, "There's something else you should know about Buildwise." And Iris tensed, because apparently this revelation had layers. And Oliver continued, "Derek doesn't know this yet, but the app he built, the intellectual property, it's actually viable. My tech team evaluated it, and with proper development and marketing, it could be worth significant money. So you have options. You could sell it, develop it yourself, or—" And he paused, watching her face. "You could give it back to him. Let him have one last chance." And Iris stared at her husband, this brilliant man who'd orchestrated Derek's humiliation, but was now offering her the choice to show mercy. And she said, "Why would I do that? Why would you even suggest that?" And Oliver said, "Because I want you to have every option. I want your healing to be yours, not mine. Not revenge I constructed, but whatever genuinely serves your peace. And if that's mercy, I'll support it. If it's crushing him, I'll support that too. I'm on your team, whatever play you want to run." And Iris felt something in her chest expand. Felt the difference between a man who controlled her narrative and a man who empowered her to write it herself. And she didn't know yet what she'd choose. Didn't know if Derek deserved mercy or destruction. But she knew she loved Oliver Stratton with a fierceness that sometimes scared her. Knew she'd found the partner she'd always needed, and whatever came next, they'd face it together. And that certainty felt like bedrock. Felt like home. The foundation office was quiet at 7 in the evening. Most of the staff had gone home, and Iris was finishing paperwork in her office when Maria Torres knocked urgently and said, "There's a man here demanding to see you. He's aggressive." I called security, but he says he won't leave until you talk to him. And Iris didn't need to ask who, because she already knew. Could feel it in the way her stomach dropped. Derek had found her here, at the one place that represented her rebirth. And when she walked to the reception area, he was there, pacing like a caged animal, his suit rumpled, his eyes wild with something that looked like panic and rage combined. And when he saw her, he rushed forward so fast that Maria stepped between them, protective. But Iris held up her hand and said, "It's okay, Maria. Call Oliver. Tell him to come now, then wait outside." Because she wasn't afraid of Derek anymore. Wasn't that cowering woman? But she also wasn't stupid. And Maria hesitated, then pulled out her phone and stepped into the hallway, leaving the door cracked. And Derek said, "You destroyed me. You took everything. Wasn't the divorce enough? Wasn't taking half enough? You had to systematically ruin my entire life." And his voice was shaking, and Iris felt a cold clarity settle over her and said, "I took half of nothing, Derek. You made sure of that. You drained our accounts and destroyed my credit before you left. And I didn't systematically ruin anything. You did that yourself with bad decisions and worse ethics." And Derek laughed, a sound without humor, and said, "Don't play innocent. Your billionaire husband has been sabotaging my business for 2 years. I have proof. Investors who were ready to sign suddenly backing out after calls from Stratton's office, permits getting delayed, contracts falling through, and now I find out you own BuildWise. You've been playing me this whole time, setting me up for today's humiliation." And Iris went very still, because she hadn't known about 2 years of sabotage. Oliver had only mentioned buying BuildWise 6 months ago, and she said carefully, "What do you mean 2 years?" And Derek pulled out his phone, shoved it at her, and she saw email threads, documented calls, a pattern of Oliver's company interfering with Derek's business ventures, and the timestamps went back 24 months, which meant Oliver had been orchestrating Derek's downfall long before he'd married Iris, possibly before he'd even dated her. And she felt something cold slither down her spine, a question she didn't want to ask but couldn't avoid. Derek was still talking, his words tumbling out desperate and angry. "You made me believe you were nothing, that I was doing you a favor by staying as long as I did. And all along you were planning this. You and your rich boyfriend. You wanted revenge and you got it. Congratulations, Iris. You win. I'm bankrupt. I'm losing my apartment. Simone left me 6 months ago. I have nothing. Absolutely nothing. So what now? You want me to beg. You want me to apologize for every shitty thing I did. Fine. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I cheated. I'm sorry I took your money. I'm sorry I made you feel worthless. I was wrong. You were always too good for me, and I knew it, and I hated you for it. I hated that you loved me when I didn't deserve it, and I destroyed you, because I was destroying myself and I needed company in the pit. And now I'm in it alone, and you're standing in penthouses. So tell me what you want from me. Tell me how to make this end." And he was crying now, actual tears. And Iris felt a complicated surge of emotions. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. She'd been in that pit, knew what desperation tasted like. But she was also processing the revelation about Oliver, about 2 years of interference. And she said, "I didn't plan any of this, Derek. I didn't even know Oliver was involved in your business failures until today. And I'm finding out right now that it went deeper than he told me." And Derek's eyes narrowed and he said, "You expect me to believe you didn't know? That you're just some innocent victim in all this? Your husband has been waging war on me since before you even married him. You really think that's coincidence?" And Iris didn't know what she thought anymore. Didn't know what to believe. And that's when Oliver walked in, striding through the door with 2 security guards behind him, his face a mask of controlled fury, and he took in the scene. Derek's tears, Iris's pale face, and said, "Get away from my wife!" And Derek laughed bitterly and said, "Or what? You'll destroy what's left of my life. Oh, wait, you already did that. Tell her. Tell Iris why you really sought her out. Tell her about the connection." And Oliver's face went absolutely still, and Iris said, "What is he talking about? What connection?" And Oliver's eyes met hers, and she saw guilt there, saw secrets. And he said, "We should discuss this privately." But Derek said, "No, she deserves to know now. Tell her how my construction company built the venue where your wife died. Tell her how I was the one who referred your wife to that driving instructor who she was sleeping with when they crashed. Tell her how you've blamed me for her death for 4 years. Tell her this was never about protecting Iris. This was about punishing me, and she was just a convenient tool." And the words hung in the air like poison. And Iris looked at Oliver and said, "Is that true?" And Oliver's expression was agony, was conflict. And he said, "It's more complicated than that." But Iris said, "Is it true?" And Oliver closed his eyes and said, "Yes. Initially, yes, I found out Derek had introduced Catherine to Marcus, the driving instructor, had encouraged the affair because he thought it was funny. And when they died, I investigated Derek and found you. Found what he'd done to you. And I wanted justice for both of us. But Iris, what developed between us, that was real. That is real. I fell in love with you. Genuinely. Completely." But Iris was backing away, was shaking her head. Because everything she'd believed about their meeting, about Oliver seeing her value, about being chosen for who she was, all of it was contaminated now, was built on revenge and manipulation. And she said, "You used me. You made me think I was worth something when really I was just a weapon against Derek." And Oliver said desperately, "No, you were never just anything. You are everything." But Iris couldn't hear it, couldn't process it. And Derek was watching with something like vindictive satisfaction, and Oliver turned on him with such rage that the security guard stepped forward. And Oliver said, "You destroyed her long before I entered the picture. You have no moral high ground here." And Derek said, "Maybe not, but at least I was honest about being a bastard. You pretended to be her savior when you were just using her like I did, just in a different way." And Iris felt like she was breaking apart, felt like the foundation she'd built her new life on was crumbling. And she said to both of them, "Get out, both of you. Get out now." And Oliver said, "Iris, please." But she said, "I need time. I need to think. Just leave." And she saw the devastation on Oliver's face, but couldn't care about it right now. Couldn't care about anything except the possibility that the last 4 years had been another kind of lie. Another man deciding who she was instead of letting her decide for herself. And as both men left, Derek escorted by security, and Oliver walking slowly like a man heading to execution, Iris sank into a chair and wondered if she'd ever really been free at all, or if she'd just traded one cage for another, gilded, but still confining, and whether anything about her new life was actually real or just another elaborate performance in someone else's play. Iris didn't go home that night, couldn't face the penthouse that suddenly felt like a museum of lies. Instead, she checked into a modest hotel under her maiden name Sullivan, turned off her phone after 17 missed calls from Oliver, and sat in the dark room staring at the city lights and wondering how she'd been so spectacularly stupid twice in one lifetime. Because at least Derek had been obviously terrible, had shown her his cruelty in ways she could name and eventually escape. But Oliver had been insidious, had wrapped his manipulation in kindness and support, had made her believe she was being seen when really she was being positioned. And the worst part was that she couldn't untangle what had been real couldn't separate genuine love from strategic performance. Because what if every tender moment had been calculated? What if every time Oliver had told her she was brilliant or strong or worthy, he'd been thinking about Derek's destruction instead of her actual value? And the thought made her physically ill, sent her running to the bathroom, where she vomited up the remains of dinner and then sat on the cold tile floor, crying until there was nothing left. The next morning, Maria called the hotel somehow. Must have tracked her credit card and said, "Oliver's losing his mind. He's called here 14 times. He's offering $100,000 to anyone who knows where you are. Please just call him." But Iris said, "Did you know? Did anyone at the foundation know who he really was before he told me?" And Maria was quiet for too long, and then said, "I knew he was the anonymous donor. I didn't know about his wife or Derek or any connection to your past. I swear, Iris, we all just thought he fell in love with you, which seemed obvious because you're amazing, and he looked at you like you hung the moon." And Iris wanted to believe that, but couldn't trust her own judgment anymore. Said, "I need a few days. Tell him I'm safe, but I need space." And Maria said, "He's devastated. I've never seen him like this. He looks like he's dying." And Iris felt a vicious satisfaction followed immediately by guilt. Because she still loved him. That was the cruel joke. She still loved Oliver Stratton, even knowing he'd orchestrated their meeting, even suspecting his motives. Her heart hadn't gotten the memo that it should stop, and that made everything worse. Made her feel weak and foolish. Made her wonder if she was just programmed to love men who used her. On the third day, her sister Rachel showed up at the hotel, let herself in with a key she must have charmed from management, and sat on the bed and said, "Okay, tell me everything." And Iris did. The whole sordid story. Derek's revelation about Oliver's dead wife, the 2 years of sabotage, the orchestrated meeting, and Rachel listened without interrupting, and then said, "So let me see if I understand. A billionaire discovered that the man indirectly responsible for his wife's death had also destroyed an innocent woman, and he decided to help that woman while also getting revenge on the man. And in the process, he fell in love with the woman and married her and treated her like a queen for 4 years. And you're upset because the initial meeting wasn't organic." And Iris said, "It's not that simple." And Rachel said, "Isn't it, though? Look, Derek was a bastard who used you and threw you away. Oliver was a man in pain who maybe started with mixed motives, but clearly loves you genuinely now. Those aren't the same thing." But Iris said, "He lied. He manipulated. He made me think I was in control of my own narrative when he was writing the script." And Rachel sighed and said, "Iris, honey, I love you, but you're spiraling. You're so traumatized from Derek that you can't accept that someone might actually love you without ulterior motives. And yes, Oliver's initial approach was questionable, but what has he done in 4 years? Has he been cruel? Has he belittled you? Has he cheated? Has he stolen from you? Or has he supported your dreams and celebrated your success and treated you with respect?" And Iris said, "That's not the point," even though it kind of was the point. And Rachel said, "What are you afraid of, really? Because I don't think this is about Oliver's motives. I think this is about you still believing on some level that you're not worth loving for yourself." And the words hit like a physical blow, because they were true. Iris realized with horrible clarity that part of her had always been waiting for Oliver to reveal that she wasn't enough, that the fairy tale was too good to be true, and Derek's revelation had just given her permission to believe the worst, to retreat to the familiar territory of not being valued. Because that felt safer than risking real vulnerability, real trust. And she started crying again and said, "I don't know how to believe I'm worth it. I don't know how to trust that someone sees me and doesn't want to fix me, or use me, or change me." And Rachel pulled her close and said, "That's the work. That's what therapy is for. But Iris, you can't let Derek win. You can't let him poison the good thing you built with Oliver just because Oliver's hands weren't perfectly clean at the beginning. Nobody's hands are clean. We all have complicated motives. The question is, what did he do with those motives? Did he harm you or help you? That night, Iris finally turned on her phone and saw 63 messages from Oliver. The first dozen desperate, the next 20 apologetic, the rest just saying he loved her and would wait as long as she needed. And there was one voicemail from Derek, and she almost deleted it. But curiosity made her listen, and Derek's voice said, "I shouldn't have told you like that. I was angry, and I wanted to hurt him by hurting you. But Iris, for what it's worth, I watched Stratton's face when you told us both to leave. And that man loves you. Like genuinely loves you. I've never seen anyone look that destroyed. And I would know because I never looked at you that way. I never loved you enough. And that was my failure, not yours. You were always enough. Always too good for me. And I destroyed something precious because I was too broken to value it. Don't make my mistake. Don't destroy something good because you're afraid. Be braver than I was." And the message ended. And Iris sat there stunned because Derek had never been insightful, had never been emotionally articulate, and this moment of clarity from him felt like the universe speaking. But she still didn't know what to do, didn't know if she could forgive Oliver's deception, didn't know if love built on complicated foundations could ever feel secure. And she fell asleep that night in the hotel bed feeling more alone than she'd felt in 4 years, feeling like she was back at the beginning, untethered and uncertain. Except this time she had more to lose, had tasted what partnership could be. And the thought of walking away from Oliver felt like choosing amputation. Necessary, maybe, but permanently diminishing. And she didn't know if she was strong enough to survive losing him. Didn't know if she was strong enough to forgive him. Didn't know anything, except that the darkest hour was knowing you had the power to save yourself or destroy yourself, and not knowing which choice was which. And tomorrow she'd have to decide, would have to choose between the safety of solitude and the risk of trusting again. And both options felt like jumping off a cliff. And she was so tired of falling, so tired of having to be brave. But morning was coming whether she was ready or not, and with it would come consequences she couldn't avoid. Iris walked into her therapist's office on the 4th morning, and Dr. Sarah Chen looked up from her notes and said, "Emergency session. This must be significant." And Iris sat down heavily and said, "I need help sorting truth from trauma response." And for the next hour, she laid out everything. The revelation about Oliver's wife, the orchestrated meeting, her fear that she'd been used, her inability to distinguish between Derek's actual abuse and Oliver's complicated motives. And Dr. Chen listened in that particular way therapists had, present and focused. And when Iris finished, Dr. Chen said, "Let me ask you something. In 4 years of marriage, has Oliver ever made a unilateral decision about your body, your career, your relationships, your autonomy?" And Iris thought about it, really thought, and said, "No. He always asks, always gives me choice. Even with the Buildwise revelation, he gave me options." And Dr. Chen nodded and said, "Has he ever belittled your intelligence, your opinions, your feelings?" And Iris said, "Never. He values my input, asks for my perspective on his business decisions, treats me like an equal partner." And Dr. Chen said, "Has he ever isolated you from support systems, controlled your finances, or made you feel afraid?" And Iris said, "No, the opposite. He encouraged my friendship with Maria. He put assets in my name. He's never once raised his voice in anger." And Dr. Chen leaned forward and said, "Iris, I'm going to say something direct. Oliver's initial approach was ethically questionable. His motives were mixed, but in 4 years he has demonstrated through consistent action that he loves you genuinely, respects your autonomy, and values your partnership, whereas Derek demonstrated the opposite. So the question isn't whether Oliver's hands are clean. The question is whether you're going to let Derek's final act of sabotage, that revelation designed to hurt you both, destroy something real. And Iris felt something shift in her chest, a loosening, because she'd been so focused on the beginning of her story with Oliver that she'd discounted 4 years of evidence. 4 years of him showing up, being honest when confronted, apologizing when wrong, celebrating her victories, supporting her dreams. And yes, he'd orchestrated their meeting. But what had he done with that meeting? He'd loved her, genuinely and completely, had given her space to grow, had never once made her feel less than. And she said slowly, I've been looking for reasons to not trust him, because trust feels dangerous. And Dr. Chen said, Of course it does. Derek made trust dangerous. But Iris, you've rebuilt everything else in your life. Your career, your confidence, your sense of self. Maybe it's time to rebuild your capacity to trust too, not blindly, but with eyes open to who Oliver has actually been, not who you fear he might be. Iris left the session with clarity she hadn't felt in days, pulled out her phone and called Oliver, and he answered on the first ring, his voice hoarse, like he hadn't slept. Iris, are you okay? Where are you? And she said, I'm okay. I'm coming home. But Oliver, I need you to do something for me first. And he said, anything, name it. And Iris said, I need you to tell me everything, every detail about Catherine, about Derek's connection, about why you really sought me out. No filtering, no protecting me, complete transparency. And Oliver was quiet for a moment and then said, meet me at the foundation in an hour. I'll tell you everything. And Iris said, why there? And Oliver said, because that's where we really began, not the boot camp, the foundation. That's where I saw who you actually were. And I want to tell you this story in the place where I fell in love with the real you, not the idea of you. An hour later, Iris walked into the foundation conference room, and Oliver was there, looking wrecked, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes red-rimmed. And when he saw her, he stood up but didn't approach, giving her space. And he said, Catherine and I had a business marriage. We liked each other, but we weren't in love. She had affairs, and I buried myself in work. And when she died with her instructor, I felt guilty that I wasn't devastated, just tired. And I investigated because I needed to feel something, and anger was available. And I found Derek had introduced them, had encouraged Marcus to pursue her, because he thought rich people's drama was entertaining, and I wanted Derek to hurt. So I investigated him and found you. Found this woman he'd destroyed financially and emotionally, and initially, yes, I saw you as leverage, as a way to understand Derek's weaknesses. But then I read your work, your foundation proposals, your ideas for helping women rebuild, and I saw brilliance. And then I met you at the boot camp, and you were so much more than I'd imagined, funny and kind despite everything. And I fell in love fast and hard and real. And I know the beginning was manipulative. I know I should have told you earlier, but Iris, every day since has been genuine. Every moment, every word of love, every plan we've made, that's been real. And I'm sorry I didn't give you the choice of knowing from the start. I'm sorry I let revenge contaminate something pure. But I love you. I love you more than I've loved anything. And if you can't forgive this, I'll understand. But I needed you to know that you were never just a weapon. You became everything. Iris walked toward him slowly and said, I believe you. I believe the love is real. But Oliver, we need to establish something. I'm not a piece on your chessboard. I'm your partner. And that means I get to decide what happens with Derek, with Buildwise, with all of it, my healing, my choices. Do you understand? And Oliver nodded and said, completely. What do you want to do? And Iris took a deep breath and said, I want to finish this. Not your way or Derek's way, my way. I want to confront Derek properly. I want to take back my narrative, and I need you to support that without controlling it. And Oliver said, I will. I promise. How can I help? And Iris said, set up a meeting. Derek, you, me, and my lawyer tomorrow. We're going to settle this once and for all. And then we're going to therapy, couples therapy, because we have things to work through. And I'm not doing this again. I'm not building a marriage on unsteady ground. And Oliver's face flooded with relief and hope. And he said, "Yes, anything, whatever you need." And Iris stepped into his arms, then let herself be held, and she felt his heart racing against her cheek, felt how scared he'd been of losing her. And she said, "I love you, even though I'm angry, even though we have work to do. I love you." And Oliver said roughly, "I love you too. I'll spend the rest of my life earning your trust, I swear." And Iris believed him, not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to do the work, willing to be accountable. And that was what Derek had never been. And she finally understood that Oliver's flawed love, was still worth fighting for. And tomorrow they'd face Derek together, not as revenge, but as closure. And Iris would finally take control of her own story, would show both men that she wasn't a prize to be won or a weapon to be wielded, but a woman who'd found her own power and would wield it herself. The conference room at Stratton Towers was deliberately neutral territory, glass walls overlooking the city. A long mahogany table where Derek sat flanked by a legal aid attorney who looked fresh out of law school, and across from him sat Iris with Oliver on her right, and her attorney James Morrison, one of the best contract lawyers in New York, on her left, and Derek looked smaller somehow. Diminished not just by circumstance, but by the weight of consequences he'd spent years outrunning. And when Iris sat down, she felt completely calm, felt the power of someone who'd done the internal work and knew exactly who they were and what they deserved. And she said, "Thank you for coming, Derek. I know you didn't have much choice given the legal complexity of the Buildwise situation, but I appreciate you showing up." And her voice was professional, controlled, the voice of someone who'd spent 4 years learning boardroom strategy and negotiation. And Derek looked confused by her tone, had probably expected anger or gloating. And he said, "Let's just get this over with. What do you want? To humiliate me further? To take the last thing I have?" And Iris opened the folder in front of her and said, "I want to tell you what's going to happen. And you're going to listen, and then you're going to make a choice. Buildwise is mine. The intellectual property, the code, the business plan, all of it. Your lawyer can verify." And James slid documents across the table, and Derek's attorney skimmed them and nodded grimly. And Iris continued, "The app is actually good. My tech team evaluated it, and with proper development and marketing, it could generate significant revenue. So here's what I'm offering. I'm going to develop Buildwise properly. I'm going to invest $2 million in development and marketing. And I'm going to give you 10% equity. Not as a gift, but as employment. You'll work as a project consultant, salary of $80,000 a year. And if the app succeeds, your equity could be worth millions. If it fails, you'll have earned honest money for honest work." And Derek stared at her like she'd spoken another language. And he said, "Why would you do that? After everything I did, why would you give me anything?" And Iris leaned forward and said, "Because I'm not you, Derek. I don't destroy people for sport. I don't kick people when they're down. You spent 10 years making me feel worthless. And I could return that favor. I could crush you completely and feel justified. But that's not who I am. That's not who I've become. However, this offer comes with conditions. 1, you sign a comprehensive NDA about our marriage, my relationship with Oliver, all of it. It stays private. 2, you attend therapy, weekly sessions for minimum 1 year, paid for by the program. 3, you volunteered 10 hours monthly at New Horizons Foundation working with men who've abused their partners. You'll help run accountability groups. And 4, you write a letter of apology, not to me. I don't need it. But to Simone and to every other woman you damaged. And you sit with what you did. Really sit with it. And those are non-negotiable. You accept all 4 conditions, or you get nothing, and I'll develop Buildwise without you, and you can watch from the poverty line." The room was silent, Derek's face cycling through emotions, disbelief, shame, calculation, and finally something that looked like genuine remorse. And he said quietly, "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve your mercy." And Iris said, "You're right. You don't. But I deserve to be the kind of person who offers it anyway. I deserve to move forward without bitterness poisoning my life. And maybe you deserve a chance to become someone better than who you've been. But Derek, be clear. This isn't friendship. This isn't reconciliation. This is me choosing my own peace over your punishment. And if you violate any condition, the offer disappears, and I will use every resource at my disposal to ensure you never work in construction or tech again. Do you understand?" And Derek nodded, his eyes wet, and said, "I understand. I'll sign whatever you want. And Iris, I know it doesn't matter now, but I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry for what I did to you. You were the best thing in my life, and I destroyed you because I hated myself. And that's not an excuse. It's just the truth." And Iris felt something release in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but closure. The ability to finally set down the weight she'd been carrying. And she said, "I hope you mean that. I hope you use this chance to actually change." And James pushed contracts across the table, and Derek's lawyer reviewed them and whispered urgently to Derek, who just shook his head and said, "It's fair. It's more than fair." And he signed, and just like that, it was done. 10 years of marriage and 4 years of aftermath resolved in 20 minutes of clear-eyed negotiation. After Derek and his lawyer left, Oliver turned to Iris and said, "That was extraordinary. You were extraordinary. You gave him justice and mercy in equal measure." And Iris said, "I gave myself peace. That's what matters." And Oliver took her hand and said, "I have something to tell you. The foundation, New Horizons. I'm signing it over to you. Full ownership. It was always supposed to be yours. I built it hoping women like you would find it. And now I want you to lead it officially. Expand it. Make it everything you've envisioned." And Iris felt tears threaten and said, "Oliver, that's a $30 million operation." And he said, "And you're the only person I trust to run it. You've been doing it already. Now it'll be official. And Iris, I need to say this. I'm proud of you. How you handled Derek. How you chose your own path instead of revenge or retreat. You've taught me something about real strength, about grace under pressure. And I love you more today than yesterday, more than I knew was possible." And Iris kissed him then, soft and sure, and said, "We're going to be okay. We have work to do. Therapy and trust building and learning to be fully transparent. But we're going to make it." And Oliver said, "I know we will, because you're the strongest person I've ever met. And I'm the luckiest man alive." And as they left the conference room hand in hand, Iris caught her reflection in the glass and saw someone she'd never seen before. Not the broken woman Derek had left. Not the rebuilt woman Oliver had found, but someone entirely new. Someone who'd taken the shattered pieces and forged them into something stronger than the original. Someone who knew her worth, bone deep, and wouldn't accept less from anyone. Someone who could offer mercy without weakness, and demand respect without cruelty. And she realized this was what victory actually looked like. Not destruction of enemies, but construction of self. Not revenge, but peace. Not proving Derek wrong, but proving herself right. Right that she deserved love, deserved respect, deserved to write her own story with her own hand. And the woman in the reflection smiled back, finally free. 18 months later, Iris stood at the podium of the New Horizons Foundation's annual gala, now held in a venue 10 times larger than their previous gatherings, because the foundation had expanded to 23 cities under her leadership, serving over 15,000 women annually. and the ballroom was filled with donors, survivors, volunteers, and supporters who'd watched the organization transform from a small operation into a national movement. And Iris no longer felt nervous speaking to crowds, had learned that her voice carried weight, that her story had power, that vulnerability shared was strength multiplied. And she said into the microphone, 5 years ago, I was sleeping in a shelter, convinced I was worthless, convinced my level was rock bottom and I should accept it. One man had spent a decade destroying my confidence, my credit, my sense of self. And when he left, he told me I'd never rise above where I was. And for a while, I believed him. But then I found this place, found women who'd survived what I'd survived, found purpose in helping others find their strength. And slowly I rebuilt, not into who I was before, because that woman was never coming back, but into someone new, someone stronger, someone who'd learned that your worth isn't determined by who loves you or leaves you, but by how you show up for yourself and others. And today, I'm proud to announce that New Horizons Foundation has received a $100 million endowment from Stratton Philanthropic Trust that will allow us to expand to all 50 states within 3 years, to help not just thousands, but hundreds of thousands of women rebuild their lives. And the room erupted in applause, and Iris caught Oliver's eye from his table in the front, and he was looking at her with such pride and love that her heart felt too big for her chest. And sitting 2 tables behind him was Derek, who attended every gala now, who'd been sober for 16 months, who ran the men's accountability groups with surprising effectiveness, who'd become not a friend, but a changed person, someone who'd done the work and was slowly becoming someone decent. And when their eyes met, Derek nodded with genuine respect. And Iris nodded back, because forgiveness was a process, not an event, and she was still processing. But she could acknowledge his growth without forgetting his damage, could hold both truths simultaneously. After the speeches and the dinner, Iris found Oliver on the terrace overlooking the city, and he pulled her against him and said, "You were magnificent in there. You always are. Watching you lead, watching you inspire people, it never gets old." And Iris leaned into his warmth and said, "We did this together. Your funding, your belief in the mission, our partnership." And Oliver said, "No, love, you did this. I just wrote checks. You built the vision. You created the programs. You hired the right people. You're the heart of all of it." And Iris turned in his arms and said, "How did I get so lucky to find you?" And Oliver smiled and said, "I ask myself the same question every day. How did I get lucky enough that you forgave my manipulative beginning, that you gave me a chance to prove my love was real?" And Iris said, "Couples therapy helped. Dr. Martinez earned every penny." And they both laughed because therapy had been hard, had forced them to confront patterns and fears and the ways they'd both been damaged by previous relationships. But it had also deepened their bond, had taught them to communicate with radical honesty, to trust with eyes open, to love without losing themselves. And Iris had never felt more secure in a relationship, more seen and valued, more genuinely partnered. Maria joined them on the terrace and said, "Sorry to interrupt, but Iris, there's someone here who wants to meet you. She saw you speak last year, and you inspired her to leave her abusive marriage. And now she's enrolled in nursing school, and she just wanted to say thank you." And Iris squeezed Oliver's hand and said, "Judy calls," and followed Maria inside. And this was the part she loved most. Not the galas or the speeches, but the individual moments. The women who told her that her story had given them permission to hope, to try, to believe they deserved better. And the nursing student was young, maybe 25, with nervous eyes and a hopeful smile. And she said, "Mrs. Stratton, I just wanted you to know that when I heard you speak about surviving and rebuilding, something clicked. I realized I didn't have to stay. I didn't have to accept cruelty as love. And I left. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done. But now I'm here. I'm in school. I'm building something. And it started with your words. And Iris hugged her and said, "It started with your courage. I just held up a mirror so you could see what was already there. You did this. You saved yourself. And I'm so proud of you." And the young woman cried happy tears and walked away stronger. And Iris felt the familiar satisfaction of purpose, of pain transformed into meaning. Late that night, back in their penthouse, Oliver and Iris lay in bed talking about the future, about the foundation's expansion, about maybe adopting a child, about growing old together. And Oliver said, "Do you ever regret it? The hard years, the suffering with Derek, the long road back?" And Iris thought about it seriously and said, "I regret the time lost, the confidence stolen, but I don't regret who I became because of it. I don't regret finding you, finding my purpose, finding myself. And maybe I needed to break completely to rebuild correctly. Maybe the woman I was before wouldn't have been strong enough for the life I have now. So no, I don't regret the journey, just some of the scenery along the way." And Oliver kissed her forehead and said, "You're the wisest person I know." And Iris laughed and said, "Wisdom is just trauma processed through therapy." And they both smiled, because it was true, because they'd both done the work, both faced their damage and chosen healing over bitterness, chosen love over fear, chosen to build something beautiful from broken materials. And as Iris drifted off to sleep, she thought about that conference room 18 months ago, about Derek's face when she'd offered mercy instead of revenge, about the choice she'd made to be someone better than her pain. And she knew with absolute certainty that she'd chosen right, that she'd finally risen above her level, not because she'd married a billionaire or run a foundation or proven Derek wrong, but because she'd learned the most important truth, that her level had never been low. She'd just been surrounded by people who couldn't see heights. And now she was surrounded by people who could fly, and she was flying too. And the view from up here was extraordinary, and she couldn't wait to see where she'd soar next. And if you've made it this far in the story, drop a comment below, telling me what you would have done in Iris's position. Would you have shown Derek mercy or chosen differently? And make sure you're subscribed, because stories like this, stories about redemption and resilience, and the sweet taste of justice, these are what we're all about here. And Iris's journey reminds us that your past doesn't determine your future. Your choices do. And every day is a chance to choose differently, to choose better, to choose yourself. And that's not just a happy ending, that's a powerful beginning.